Hi everyone, and welcome back to Echo Barrow, a place where history comes alive and complex stories are made clear. Today, we'll uncover the sweeping story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, spanning from ancient kingdoms of the Iron Age to the struggles that shape our world today. This conflict between Israelis and Palestinians has lasted for generations, making headlines around the world. But why? Why has it proven so hard to solve? Why does it inspire such deep emotions, not only locally, but globally? To really understand it, we have to travel back in time, not just decades, but thousands of years. This is a story about ancient faiths and empires, colonial promises, wars, refugees, and two people each claiming the same land as home. Let's trace this conflict from ancient kingdoms and conquests to modern wars and failed peace deals to understand why it remains one of the world's most stubborn and painful disputes. Our story begins thousands of years ago, in the land historically known as Canaan, a region in the eastern Mediterranean, roughly covering parts of modern Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. This land has been revered by Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. In ancient times, it saw the rise of the Israelite kingdoms. During the Iron Age, roughly 1200 to 586 BCE, two related Hebrew kingdoms, Israel and Judah, ruled much of the region. It was the biblical kingdom of Israel where, according to scripture, kings David and Solomon reigned, and the first temple stood in Jerusalem. These early Jewish kingdoms coexisted and clashed with other people. Along the southern coast lived the Philistines, a seafaring people believed to have originated from the Aegean region, who settled in fortified coastal cities like Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. They were known for their military strength and frequent conflicts with the Israelites, famously remembered in stories like David and Goliath. Beyond them were neighboring realms and tribal kingdoms in what are today Jordan and Syria, making the land a dynamic crossroads of alliances, trade, and warfare. This ancient Jewish presence would later be central to the claims and spiritual connection of Jews to the land. In 586 BCE, however, the Babylonian Empire centered in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, conquered Judah, destroyed Solomon's temple, and exiled many Jews. They returned and rebuilt the temple under Persian rule, only to see it destroyed again centuries later by the Romans. Persia, by the way, being what we now call Iran. History does have its twists. By the 1st century BCE, the region was under Rome's occupation. Judea, as the Romans called the area, bristled under foreign rule, and Jewish revolts erupted. The most fateful uprising came in 132 to 135 CE, when Simon Bar Kokhba led a fierce rebellion against Rome, a leader who inspired hope as a messiah for many Jews. Roman legions brutally crushed it, reportedly killing hundreds of thousands of Jews. In the aftermath, Emperor Hadrian, the Roman ruler at that time, renamed Judea as Syria Palestina, the first use of Palestine to designate the province, and, according to some accounts, banned Jews from Jerusalem. This marked the start of a vast Jewish diaspora, as Rome's brutal suppression of the revolt and destruction of Judea forced many Jews to scatter widely beyond their historic homeland, establishing communities throughout the Mediterranean and Middle East, even as some Jewish populations remained in Galilee, a region in northern Israel, and in other areas. Meanwhile, Jerusalem was rebuilt as a Roman city called Aelia Capitolina, and Christianity spread across the Roman Near East, the eastern provinces like Judea, Syria, and Lebanon. By the 4th century, the Roman Byzantine Empire had embraced Christianity, turning Jerusalem into a major center of Christian pilgrimage. Churches rose over holy sites, and the city became sacred to Christians, as it already was to Jews. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell, each leaving its mark on the Holy Land's tapestry. In the 7th century, a new power from Arabia swept in. In 637 CE, the forces of the nascent Islamic Caliphate besieged and captured Jerusalem. The city's Byzantine Christian patriarch surrendered to Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, who, as tradition holds, entered Jerusalem humbly. Umar permitted Jews, who had been barred under Byzantine rule, to return to Jerusalem and even pray at their ancient holy sites. Under Muslim rule, the land, now often called Palestine, became predominantly Arab and Islamic, but it remained a mosaic of faiths. The Dome of the Rock was built around 691 CE in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, enshrining the rock revered in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition. This era of early Islamic caliphates, Umayyad, then Abbasid, generally saw a relative coexistence among Muslims, Christians, and Jews, all considered people of the book in Islamic law. But the land's sanctity would draw others with competing visions. In 1099, amid the fervor of the Crusades, European Christian knights stormed Jerusalem. The First Crusade seized the Holy City, and chroniclers recount that the Crusaders massacred many of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. The conquerors established the Kingdom of Jerusalem and other Crusader states. For nearly a century, Latin Christian kings ruled in Jerusalem, turning the Dome of the Rock into a church and restricting other faiths. Yet their foothold was tenuous. Saladin, the famed Muslim general of Kurdish origin and sultan of the Ayyubid dynasty, united Muslim forces. In 1187, he defeated the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin and liberated Jerusalem, ending 88 years of Crusader rule. Saladin famously allowed Christian inhabitants to leave or stay safely, and even some Jews to return. Over the 13th century, the Crusaders mounted more campaigns, but ultimately Muslim dynasties, first the Ayyubids, then the Mamluks, expelled them completely by 1291. For the next few centuries, the land of Palestine became a quiet corner of great empires. The Mamluk Sultanate controlled it until 1517, when the Ottoman Empire conquered the region. Under Ottoman rule, 1517 to 1917, Palestine was not a separate country, but a part of the provinces of Ottoman Syria. Still, cities like Jerusalem, Nablus, Gaza, Jaffa, and Hebron thrived as market towns and holy sites. The population was mostly Arabic-speaking Muslim, with Christian and Jewish minorities living in relative peace under the Ottoman millet system, which allowed religious communities to govern their own affairs. For centuries, Ottoman Palestine saw periods of stability and diversity, albeit amid imperial neglect. Travelers in the 19th century found ancient villages among terraced hills and the old city walls of Jerusalem sheltering communities of many faiths. Little did the inhabitants know that enormous changes loomed as empires and ideas from abroad would soon upend this age-old order. By the late 19th century, new ideologies swept over the people of the Middle East and Europe alike. Nationalism, the desire for self-determination of people, began stirring within the Ottoman Empire's many ethnic groups, including the Arabs. At the same time, in Europe, Jews faced rising anti-Semitism, pogroms, and exclusion. This galvanized a movement called Zionism, Jewish nationalism, which sought to establish a safe homeland for the Jewish people, ideally in their ancestral land of Palestine. In 1897, Theodor Herzl, an Austro-Hungarian Jew, convened the First Zionist Congress, proclaiming the goal of creating a Jewish national home in Palestine. For Zionists, the biblical connection to the land and the urgent need to escape persecution converged. Starting in the 1880s, waves of Jewish immigrants, many escaping Russian pogroms or later the turmoil of World War I, arrived in Ottoman Palestine. They bought land, sometimes from absentee landlords, and founded agricultural settlements. Though still a small minority, by 1914 Jews were about 6% of the population. These pioneers planted the seeds of a future Jewish state. Meanwhile, educated Arab Ottomans, including those in Syria and Palestine, began articulating Arab nationalist ideas. They imagined independence from Turkish Ottoman rule and the unity of Arab-speaking peoples. By the early 20th century, Arab locals in Palestine were becoming aware that Zionist immigration could threaten their majority and their connection to the land. Tensions simmered between the tiny but growing Jewish settler community, the Yishuv, and the Arab population, though under Ottoman rule overt conflict was limited. It would take the crucible of World War I to truly ignite these competing national aspirations. In 1914, World War I erupted, and the Middle East was a major prize. The declining Ottoman Empire sided with Germany and the Central Powers. Britain and France plotted to carve up Ottoman lands in the event of victory, and they made promises, some secret, some public, that would later haunt Palestine. In 1915-16, British High Commissioner Henry McMahon corresponded with Sharif Hussein of Mecca, hinting that if the Arabs revolted against the Ottomans, Britain would support an independent Arab kingdom in the region. Believing these assurances, Arab forces, led by Hussein's son Faisal, joined the British war effort. Yet at the same time, May 1916, Britain and France secretly signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement, envisioning dividing the Middle East between their colonial spheres, with Palestine slated for international administration given its sacred status. Then, in November 1917, as British troops fought up through Sinai toward Palestine, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued the famous Balfour Declaration. In a letter to Lord Rothschild, Balfour stated that Britain supported the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, while adding that nothing should prejudice the rights of the existing non-Jewish communities. With this, Great Britain publicly embraced Zionism, a gesture welcomed by many Jews and viewed with alarm by Arabs. In December 1917, British General Edmund Allenby entered Jerusalem, having defeated the Ottomans. By 1918, World War I ended with Ottoman defeat, and Britain took control of Palestine. Competing promises now collided. The local Arab populace, over 90% of Palestine's inhabitants at the time, expected independence or inclusion in an Arab state, as implied by McMahon's letters. Zionist Jews, on the other hand, expected Britain to facilitate their national home, as promised by Balfour. In 1920, the victors of World War I met at San Remo and formally granted Britain a mandate over Palestine and France a mandate over Syria-Lebanon. The League of Nations mandate for Palestine, finalized in 1922, enshrined the Balfour Declaration. Britain was tasked with helping establish a Jewish national home in Palestine while also safeguarding the civil and religious rights of the Arab majority. From the start, the British mandate was a powder keg. Palestinian Arabs felt betrayed. Their aspirations for self-rule deferred. In 1920, 1921, and 1929, tensions exploded into communal violence. Protests and riots broke out, often sparked by disputes over holy places or new Jewish immigration. One flashpoint was the Western Wall, also known as the Wailing Wall, in Jerusalem, sacred to Jews and located next to important Islamic holy sites. By the late 1920s, riots led to scores of deaths on both sides. British commissions of inquiry struggled to recommend solutions, often suggesting limits to Jewish immigration, only for Zionists to object. Meanwhile, Jewish immigration surged, especially as European anti-Semitism worsened. During the 1920-30, tens of thousands of Jews arrived from Eastern Europe and Germany. The Jewish population rose from about 1/10 of the country in 1918 to nearly 30% by the mid-1930s. Many new immigrants were desperate refugees from Nazism. They joined existing Jewish communities, built new towns like Tel Aviv, and formed defense forces, the Haganah. The Arabs of Palestine, largely peasants and townsfolk, saw land being sold out from under them, often by absentee landlords, and feared becoming a minority in their own homeland. By the mid-1930s, Palestinian Arabs reached a boiling point. In 1936, Arab frustration at continued Jewish immigration and British rule erupted into a full-scale uprising known as the Arab Revolt of 1936-39, the first major, sustained Palestinian nationalist revolt. It began in April 1936 with spontaneous violence, after 2 Jews were killed in an attack on a convoy, and, in retaliation, Jewish paramilitaries killed 2 Arab peasants near Anabda. Anger swept the country. Local militant followers of a preacher, Sheikh Is al-Din al-Qassam, killed by the British the year before, took to the hills. Palestinian political parties united to form an Arab Higher Committee under Jerusalem's Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini. They declared a general strike that lasted months, demanding a halt to Jewish immigration, a ban on land sales to Jews, and independence. The strike and peasant-led guerrilla attacks paralyzed the country. British authority began to buckle as rural areas slipped from their control. The British response was swift and harsh. Alarmed by the scale of the revolt, which mobilized thousands of Arabs from all classes in nationalist fervor, Britain dispatched over 20,000 troops to Palestine. The Zionist Yishuv, for its part, mobilized its own defenses. By 1939, the Jewish Haganah militia had over 15,000 trained fighters. The revolt waxed and waned over 3 bloody years. Villages were bombed and rebels hunted down by British soldiers. A young officer named Ord Wingate was among those leading counterinsurgency operations. The British also armed Jewish auxiliary forces to help suppress the Arab rebels. By 1939, the rebellion was crushed at a terrible cost. Over 5,000 Palestinians were killed, their leadership decimated, many arrested, exiled, or on the run, and the Arab economy shattered. The British execution of rebels and collective punishments left deep scars. During the revolt, Britain tried a political solution. In 1937, a royal commission headed by Lord Peel investigated the unrest. The Peel Commission report concluded that the conflict arose from irreconcilable Arab and Jewish national aspirations. Right against right, as it famously described. It deemed the mandate unworkable and, boldly, recommended partition of Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish, one Arab, with British control over a corridor including Jerusalem. For the first time, a British body spoke of creating a Jewish state on about 20% of Palestine. Zionist leaders were ambivalent but accepted partition in principle, seeing it as a stepping stone to statehood. Palestinian Arabs, however, were horrified. They rejected partition outright, especially the suggestion of forced transfer of Arabs out of the proposed Jewish area. When the British government floated a smaller-scale partition in 1938, the Woodhead Commission, it too failed to gain support. Ultimately, with World War II looming, Britain changed tack. It issued a white paper in 1939 limiting Jewish immigration drastically to 75,000 over 5 years and promising eventual independence for a unified Palestine within 10 years, effectively renouncing the idea of a Jewish state. This white paper was seen as a betrayal by Zionists, but it temporarily appeased Arab demands, helping to end the revolt. By 1939, Palestine was scarred and subdued, just as a greater calamity was about to engulf the world. Then came World War II, 1939 to 45, bringing cataclysm to Europe and new trauma to the Holy Land. The Jewish people suffered the Holocaust, Nazi Germany's genocide that murdered 6 million Jews. European Jewry was devastated, and hundreds of thousands of survivors were left displaced with nowhere to go. Palestine, in their eyes, was their haven, but the British White Paper barred their entry. During the war, Britain, needing Arab support, kept Palestine's doors nearly shut to Jewish refugees. Desperate Holocaust survivors languished in European camps or attempted to reach Palestine clandestinely on overcrowded ships like the Exodus 1947, only to be turned back by the Royal Navy. This humanitarian tragedy galvanized world sympathy for the Zionist cause. Within Palestine, the war years were tense but relatively quiet. Many Palestinian Arabs, though hostile to Zionism, opposed the fascist axis as well. Many Jews in Palestine joined the British Army, some 27,000 enlisted to fight Hitler. A smaller number of extremist Zionists, however, saw Britain as the main enemy and waged an anti-British campaign. Groups like the Irgun, led by Menachem Begin, and the Lehi, Stern Gang, resorted to terror attacks against British officials and infrastructure. They sought to force Britain to allow Jewish immigration and leave Palestine. In 1944, Lehi even assassinated Britain's minister in the Middle East, Lord Moyne. By 1945, as the world learned the full horror of the Holocaust, pressure mounted on Britain to admit Jewish refugees. U.S. President Harry Truman urged Britain to let in 100,000 Jewish displaced persons. But British authorities, facing angry Arab opposition and stretched by post-war austerity, refused to lift the ban. Britain's colonial grip was weakening. The Holy Land was becoming ungovernable. Jewish insurgents bombed the British administrative headquarters at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in July 1946, killing 91 people. Palestinian Arabs, for their part, were leaderless. The Mufti Haj Amin had fled to exile and still reeling from the revolt's suppression, but they seethed as Jewish immigration, often illegal, continued. The British Army now had 100,000 troops in Palestine trying to keep order, a costly deployment for a bankrupt empire. By early 1947, Britain had had enough. London announced it would terminate the mandate and hand over the problem of Palestine to the newly formed United Nations. The stage was set for an international solution, or so it seemed. In 1947, the world community attempted to solve what had become an intractable conflict. The United Nations formed a special committee, UNSCOP, to recommend Palestine's future. After surveying conditions on the ground, including touring refugee camps of Holocaust survivors and hearing Arab and Jewish testimonies, UNSCOP delivered its plan. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly approved Resolution 181, the Partition Plan. It recommended ending the British Mandate and dividing Palestine into two independent states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem under international administration due to its unique religious importance. The proposed map granted about 56% of Palestine to a Jewish state and about 43% to an Arab state, with Jerusalem and Bethlehem as an international enclave. This allocation was contentious. Jews, who by then were one-third of the population, were to get slightly over half the land, including the fertile coastal plain and much of the Negev Desert. Arabs, over two-thirds of the population, would receive the remainder, including the Central Highlands and a coastal strip around Gaza. The Jewish state as drawn would have an almost 45% Arab minority within it, while the Arab state would be entirely Arab. Zionist leaders accepted the UN plan. Despite misgivings, they had hoped for Jerusalem and more territory. For them, partition was a momentous victory, international legitimacy for a Jewish state. As news of the UN vote spread on that November day in Tel Aviv, Jews danced in the streets. But the Palestinian Arabs and surrounding Arab states flatly rejected the plan. They felt it was grossly unfair. Why should a third of the people get more than half the land, especially when much of the land allotted to the Jewish state was owned or inhabited by Arabs? Arab delegates warned that partition violated the UN Charter's principle of self-determination, since Palestine's Arab majority opposed it. When the UN announcement came, Arab Palestine erupted in a general strike and furious protests. Violence between the communities broke out almost immediately, essentially the start of a civil war. Britain, exhausted and intent on leaving, announced it would end the mandate on May 14, 1948, and withdraw its forces. But as British troops pulled out, Jews and Arabs in Palestine plunged into conflict. From December 1947 onward, the two communities fought for control of roads, cities, and strategic points. The better organized Jewish Haganah moved to secure the areas earmarked for the Jewish state and in some cases beyond. Arab volunteers from neighboring countries joined local Palestinian fighters, but there was little central coordination. By spring 1948, the war escalated. In April, the Irgun's attack on the Arab village of Deir Yassin, killing over 100 villagers, spread panic among Palestinians. At the same time, Arab militiamen ambushed a Jewish medical convoy to Hadassah Hospital, killing 78. Fear and exodus began. Palestinians from mixed cities like Haifa and Jaffa fled as battles raged. By May 1948, an estimated 250,000 Palestinian Arabs had already fled or been expelled from their homes amid the violence. On May 14, 1948, a fateful line was crossed. That afternoon, in Tel Aviv, Jewish leader David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel effective at midnight, as the British mandate expired. The new state's birth was rooted in the UN Partition Plan's borders, though Ben-Gurion did not specify boundaries in the declaration. U.S. President Harry Truman granted recognition within minutes. Jubilant Jews celebrated their long-awaited nationhood. But for the Arab Palestinians, this moment marked the beginning of what they call al-Nakba, the catastrophe. The very next day, May 15, 1948, armies of 5 Arab states, Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, moved in to intervene on behalf of the Palestinian Arabs. The first Arab-Israeli war erupted in full force. The 1948 war was a war of survival and identity for both sides. Israelis, many of them recent Holocaust survivors, felt they were fighting a second war of liberation, a war of independence, against armies bent on their destruction. Arab governments framed their intervention as rescuing Palestine and restoring law and order after Britain's withdrawal. But in truth, the Arab forces were not unified in strategy and were often outmatched by the mobilized Israeli militias, now the Israel Defense Forces (IDF). Heavy fighting raged over the next months in waves. First, the Israelis halted the Arab advance, then a UN-mediated truce, then renewed fighting. Jerusalem was a major battleground, Jewish West Jerusalem held by the Haganah and Arab East Jerusalem, including the Old City, besieged by the Arab Legion of Transjordan. In the north, Israeli forces clashed with Syrians around the Galilee. In the south, they battled Egyptians in the Negev and around the besieged Palestinian coastal strip of Gaza. Through mid-1948, the tide turned decisively in Israel's favor. The reasons were manifold. The Israelis had superior organization, internal lines of communication, and eventually arms, notably after acquiring Czech weapons, while the Arab armies were disunited and logistically stretched. One by one, Arab offensives stalled. Transjordan's Arab Legion, the best Arab force, took East Jerusalem and the West Bank highlands, but avoided invading territory allotted to the Jewish state, a reflection of Jordan's own designs on the Arab part of Palestine. By the fall of 1948, the IDF went on the offensive, expanding beyond the UN partition lines. It captured the Galilee, pushed the Egyptian army out of the Negev up to the Gaza Strip, and even briefly crossed into Egyptian Sinai. Arab villages and urban neighborhoods emptied in fear or were conquered. In some cases, Israeli forces ordered expulsions. Dozens of massacres or atrocities, like Deir Yassin earlier and later at Lydda and Al-Dawayma, terrorized civilians. By the time armistice agreements were signed in 1949, an estimated 700,000 to 750,000 Palestinians, roughly half the Arab population of pre-war Palestine, had fled or were expelled from their homes. They poured into refugee camps in neighboring Arab lands. The Gaza Strip, held by Egypt, the West Bank, held by Transjordan, Lebanon, Syria, and beyond. Hundreds of Palestinian towns and villages, over 500, were depopulated during the war. Many were razed or repopulated with Jewish immigrants, and maps were redrawn with Hebrew place names. The war formally ended by early 1949 with separate armistice deals. The new armistice lines, known as the Green Line, now defined the rough borders of Israel. Israel survived and significantly expanded its territory, controlling about 78% of the former British Mandate versus 55% allotted by the UN plan. It held all of Coastal Plain, Galilee, and Negev, as well as West Jerusalem. Transjordan annexed the West Bank and East Jerusalem. In 1950, it renamed itself Jordan. Egypt kept control of the Gaza Strip. No Arab Palestinian state emerged. The areas where it was meant to arise were now split between Jordanian and Egyptian control. The Palestinians themselves, stateless and shattered, began their long exile. Those who stayed in the new Israel, about 150,000 Arabs, became Israeli citizens, but under military rule for years. The majority, however, were refugees, their homes and lands taken by Israel, which barred their return. This is the Nakba, the defining Palestinian tragedy. For Jews, 1948 was a triumphant independence. For Palestinians, it was the catastrophic loss of their homeland. These dual narratives of 1948, independence versus Nakba, would shape both people's identities and the contours of the conflict for generations. The 1948 war ended, but the conflict was far from settled. New battles, shifting borders, and rising movements were just around the corner. Join us in Part 2 to see what came next.